Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the quiet corners of a world you've never really been told about. You've probably seen thousands of weddings in movies, gleaming rings, polished vows, choreographed kisses, but what if I told you that for most of medieval history, there were no rings, none, not even a whisper of gold for the average bride. Instead, there was a sigh, a knot of wool, a glance held a little too long at a market stall. The ritual didn't sparkle, it scratched. And the promises, they didn't glitter, they stuck to the skin like smoke or damp linen. That's the part we forget. We look back and assume love was loud and ceremonial. But this story doesn't shout, it hides. It waits, and it reveals something we may not want to remember. You probably won't survive this with your modern idea of forever intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're not in a cathedral. You're not in a jewelry shop. You're in a field. The grass is patchy and wet with late spring rain. And there's no audience but a goose squawking in the distance, and maybe one very uninterested cow. You and your betrothed stand awkwardly under an elm tree, and there is no ring, no priest, no choir, just the air, a little too cold, and a future you're trying to pretend you can believe in. This is marriage how it really looked for most people in medieval Europe. Forget the opulence of royal weddings and castle halls. Most unions began in the dirt, in whispers, in half-understood words repeated from one village elder to another. Sometimes it started with a handshake, other times a piece of bread broken between you, a sighing acknowledgement, and if there was a witness, that was a luxury. Historians still argue whether the early church even wanted to formalize marriage in the first place. For centuries, it was more of a private understanding, a consensual agreement. Yes, but not one that required liturgy or Latin. The idea that a ring was necessary, that came much, much later. What was necessary, at least to the hearts involved, was something visible, something holdable, not expensive, but felt, a token. That could be anything. A shard of polished wood, a lock of hair, a crust of bread kept in the pocket until it turned rock hard. One recorded case from the 1100s mentions a plowman's daughter who accepted her marriage proposal by handing over her favorite spindle. It was worn smooth at the base, slightly cracked at the top, but to her, it was everything. She spun with it, she thought with it, and now she trusted someone else to hold it. That's not a Hollywood gesture. That's the kind of promise that stings. And then there were the broomstick weddings. You've heard the phrase tossed around like a joke, but it was real. In many parts of Britain and later in colonial America, couples jumped over a broom to seal their union. No ring, no legal paper, just a leap, a clasped hand, and the quiet thud of straw against stone. Of course, the church hated it. They tried to outlaw it, shame it, but still it lingered. You probably wouldn't know this, but in 12th century Hungary, a marriage was often solidified with a piece of linen, usually the woman's headscarf, or a strip of her sleeve. The man would wrap it around his wrist or carry it inside his tunic. It wasn't flashy. It didn't clink, but it smelled like her. And then you had hand fasting, not the romanticized, Renaissance fair version with satin ribbons and fairy music, but the rougher kind, done with rope or hemp, or even a braided stalk of grain. The couple's hands tied together for a few moments, or a day, or a full year. In Scotland and parts of Scandinavia, it marked a trial period, live together, work together, and if it holds, stay together. It wasn't law, it was trust. There's one story from a French farming village where the bride-to-be gave her groom a carved wooden spoon, and in return, he gave her his mother's sewing needle. No inscriptions, no jewels, just tools, exchanged in the hope they'd be used together. This wasn't romance in the modern sense. This was survival, making a promise to survival. And still, some women carried nothing. No ring, no knot, no spoon or sleeve. Just the memory of a word spoken by moonlight, or a gesture too small for anyone else to notice. Because, in many ways, that was the vow. It didn't need to be seen. It needed to be remembered. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wasn't there some use of rings in medieval Europe? Sure, for the rich. And even then, it was symbolic only. Rings made of gold or silver were used in formal ceremonies in aristocratic circles, especially from the 13th century onward, but they were often reused or passed down like furniture. And among the poor, if there was a ring at all, it might be made of twisted wire, bone, or cheap iron, so poorly made it would stain the skin. One quirky detail you'll love: some medieval women believed if you slept with a ring under your tongue, you'd dream of your future husband. Not wear it, not flaunt it, just taste it in your sleep. Maybe that's where desire lives, behind the teeth, not on the hand. But perhaps the most haunting thing, how many of these unions were forgotten. No documents, no rings to inherit, no photos to frame, just lives lived and vanished. The only proof of marriage might be a child's name, a shared grave, or a worn-down footpath between two once adjacent cottages. And still, they counted. Still, they mattered. There's this modern illusion that marriage has always looked the same. A diamond ring, a perfect dress, two families awkwardly crammed into folding chairs. But really, the idea of marriage has always been fluid. Some couples sealed it with bread, some did it with rope, some never even spoke the words aloud, just lived the truth of it until death or the plague or a better offer carried them away. You're starting to feel the weight of it now, aren't you? The quiet rituals, the unsaid promises, the way love doesn't need an audience, it just needs witnesses, even if the only witness is the wind. So tonight, we begin with empty hands. No gold, no ring box, no Instagram filter, just a girl, a boy, a bit of wet grass, and a promise that might never be seen again. And somehow, that makes it more sacred. You run your fingers through your hair without thinking, a nervous habit. Right. But centuries ago, that same motion meant something far deeper. Because back then, your hair wasn't just part of you. It was you. It held scent, memory, even perceived power. And when a woman braided strands of her own hair and tied them around her wrist or someone else's, she wasn't just making jewelry, she was making a vow. In parts of medieval Scandinavia, Germany, and even across the Slavic regions, it wasn't uncommon for a bride to offer a cord made from her own hair to her husband-to-be, not for decoration, for devotion. Historians still argue whether this act had religious undertones or was rooted in ancient pagan rites of binding, but the effect was the same. It was intimate, almost unsettlingly so. You didn't just say yes, you tied yes around someone's pulse. That braid might be wrapped around the man's sword hilt, tucked into the folds of his tunic, or hidden beneath the bedpost for protection. And if you ever wondered how binding love could be, imagine knowing your lover carried a piece of your body into battle. Not a ring, not an idea, but a literal thread of your being. That's what medieval women offered. Not a diamond, but a strand. Of course, hair wasn't always used so solemnly. Sometimes, it was cheeky. One recorded case from the Burgundian court describes a noblewoman who slipped a braid into her fiancé's glove before a tournament. He didn't find it until his hand was already sweating inside the leather, and by then, the whole court was watching. Everyone laughed, but no one missed the implication she was claiming his hand in more ways than one. Hair, you see, had layers, symbolic, sensual, sacred, and unlike rings, which could be bought or stolen, hair was earned, grown, cut deliberately, given with intent. You couldn't fake it. You couldn't outsource it. It smelled like you. It aged like you. And let's be honest, it got everywhere. Just like love. There's also a lingering superstition that a braid made from a woman's hair could entrap a man's soul. Sounds dramatic, but many medieval people believed hair was directly tied to vitality. Why else would monks shave their heads to humble themselves, or witches be identified by long, wild locks? There was something dangerous about uncut hair, and something even more dangerous about handing it to someone else. In a way, giving your hair was like saying, "Here's my shadow. Hold it close." You walk into a marriage with your body, don't you? In modern times, we dress it up, trim it down, filter it. But back then, it was about presenting something real, something yours. And hair, especially for women, was considered the most intimate extension of the self. Before veils and corsets came into fashion, hair was everything. Loose hair meant freedom. Braided hair meant promise. Covered hair meant submission. So when a woman plucked a strand from her own head, or cut a small lock and wove it into a cord, it wasn't just aesthetics. It was status, a kind of spoken silence. There's a fringe theory among anthropologists that in early marriage customs, especially those practiced among the peasantry women, would braid their hair together as part of the pre-wedding ritual. Literally, two women, often sisters or friends, would sit with the bride and intertwine strands of her hair with symbolic fibers, flax for prosperity, wool for warmth, nettle for endurance, and sometimes one thin strand of her future husband's hair would be added in, collected from a comb or a pillow, not visible from a distance, but felt deeply, and when the braid was finished, the bride might tuck it into the lining of her dress or under her pillow on the wedding night, or if she was bold, tie it around her ankle. Hidden love, worn like a secret vow. Some regional traditions added small bells or beads to the hair braid, tiny ones, so small you'd only hear them if the room was very still. Some brides braided coins into the strands soft, worn coins that clinked when they moved. One tale from southern Italy tells of a bride whose braided hair cord included 3 copper coins, one from her mother, one from her grandmother, and one stolen from the altar box, cheeky, but symbolic of body, family, and fate. These weren't decorations, they were maps, tokens, history folded into a strand. And when hair wasn't braided, it was burnt. Yes, burnt. Some rural households believed that, to keep love strong, a couple had to burn a lock of each other's hair under the bed after their first night together. The smell, they believed, sealed the spirits. You can laugh, but think about it, that scent, charred protein and smoke, lingers longer than any perfume, longer than memory itself. Even the church had opinions. Ecclesiastical records from 14th century England include priests chastising brides who wore visible hair cords during ceremonies, calling them pagan relics. But of course, the more forbidden something became, the more delicious it was to keep doing it. Secret cords tucked under veils, hair tokens buried in pillow stuffing. In a world with no rings, no Facebook status, no matching bathrobes, this was how you said, "I am yours." Let's pause for a second. Imagine you're that bride. You've sat for hours while 2 older women plait your hair, muttering half-jokes and warnings under their breath. They braid it tight, not for beauty, but for magic. The last strand is your own, yanked painfully from behind your ear. You wince, they laugh, and then they tie it into a knot, murmuring words you don't fully understand. That knot goes into a pouch. That pouch goes into your sleeve. And you walk into your wedding with something stronger than a ring. You walk in bound. Even centuries later, hair keeps surfacing as a love token. During the Victorian era, yes, that's a jump forward. But hear me out, lockets with hair inside were all the rage. Tiny curls preserved under glass. Mourning brooches with woven hair patterns. It wasn't a new idea. It was the evolution of something older, quieter, and somehow more honest. Because a ring can be taken off. It slips. It clinks against countertops and sinks into bathtubs. But a strand of hair, once it's given. It weaves into memory, into cloth, into ritual. You may wear metal now, and post your anniversaries online, and throw parties to celebrate vows, but somewhere deep in your instincts, you still understand the power of a small gesture. The strand tucked behind the ear, the first brush of fingers through someone else's hair, the ache when you find a strand on your pillow after they've gone. These are vows too. So next time someone asks where the wedding ring tradition began, tell them this: it didn't start with metal. It started with memory, with fingers, with a strand. And maybe if you listen closely, you'll still hear the faintest whisper of a braid, swinging softly under a medieval girl's sleeve, keeping time with the rhythm of her steps, saying over and over again, "I gave you this, so I wouldn't forget." You press your palm against your chest for a moment, maybe out of instinct, maybe just because you're cold, but in another century, that same motion might mean something else entirely. In the late medieval period, particularly across Western Europe, Women kept small marriage tokens tucked beneath layers of fabric right against their skin. No ring on a finger, no necklace on display, but a secret held tight in the bodice. Sometimes it was a carved piece of bone in the shape of a heart or a cross. Other times, it was a miniature scroll of parchment, bearing a prayer or the initials of a lover, folded so finely it left an imprint on the skin. These weren't worn to be seen. They were worn to be felt, hidden. Yes, but pulsing against the heartbeat like a vow that never had to be spoken aloud. You know how today people say, "I carry you in my heart"? Well, these women literally did. And if you ever wonder why we romanticize the idea of something close to the chest, it might just be because, for centuries, that's where love lived. The layering of fabric in medieval fashion made this possible, especially among women. Linen underdresses, woolen gowns, tightly bound corsets. There were pockets, folds, secret slits sewn into seams, and in these soft, invisible sanctuaries, women slipped in tokens that were never meant for the world to see. Not because they were ashamed, but because they knew the world wouldn't understand. Love wasn't always a performance. Sometimes it was survival. Historians still argue whether these tokens functioned more as amulets than mementos. Did they offer protection, or were they simply proof like receipts of affection, hidden away from prying eyes and skeptical priests? One Flemish woman, recorded in a village court record from the 1400s, was caught with a dried sprig of rosemary wrapped in waxed cloth sewn into her bodice. The accusation was witchcraft. Her defense: it was a love token, rosemary for remembrance. She had worn it every day since her husband left for the Crusades, even after word came that he'd died. Was it magical? Maybe. But more than that, it was marital. Another curious tale comes from the Iberian Peninsula, where it was not uncommon for women to carry a heartstone in their bodice. These were smooth pebbles, sometimes naturally heart-shaped, sometimes etched crudely with the initials of two names, found along riverbanks or polished by fire. They were believed to link the souls of two people. One pebble, two hearts. If the woman died wearing it, the story goes, her spirit would find her beloved in the afterlife, even if he'd long since married another. Tragic, yes, but also kind of poetic in that cry in the bathtub sort of way. And then there were the fabric hearts. These were small, stuffed charms sewn from scraps of a lover's clothing, a square of his sleeve, a shred from his collar. One recorded case in London around 1370 involved a woman accused of theft, not for money, but for taking a strip of fabric from a man's doublet while he slept. She'd sewn it into a cloth heart and stitched it inside her underdress. She was eventually acquitted, not because the court believed in love, but because the man admitted he'd rather she kept it than scorned him publicly. Romantic justice, medieval style. The upper classes had their own variations. Wealthy women sometimes carried miniature ivory carvings shaped like animals, often rabbits or swan, symbols of fidelity, fertility, and, well, let's be honest, a few more adult meanings that we're not going to spell out with the lights off. Some of these were engraved with Latin phrases semper tua, always yours, nulli alii, to no other, and worn in the folds of fine linen chemises. You didn't display them, you just knew they were there. What makes these hidden objects so fascinating is how deliberately unsentimental they were. A modern ring is meant to dazzle. These tokens, they were meant to disappear. If you had to prove the marriage later, say, if your lover ran off or died, you could produce the token. You could say, he gave me this, he promised me, and that might be enough. A court might listen, a village might believe. That tiny scrap in your corset might just hold your entire legal future. There's also something oddly powerful in the idea of carrying your own memory. You don't wait for someone else to show the world your worth. You sew it into your sleeve, you tuck it into your bodice, you wear it like a shield no one else can see. In a world where women were often silent witnesses to their own lives, these tokens whispered back. One fringe theory even suggests that some women used herbal tokens, sage, thyme, or myrrh resin as sensual signals, not just for love, but for desire. Hidden scent, subtle aroma, not overpowering like perfume, but earthy, tangible. The kind of thing you only noticed if you got close enough to hear a breath hitch, to see a pulse flutter at the neck. These weren't seduction tools so much as symbols. I choose you. I know what I want. And then there were the relics of absence. Objects worn not to celebrate a union, but to mourn a bond that never fully formed. A pressed violet, a coin from a pilgrimage made together, a button that fell off his coat when he hugged you too tightly that one time. You don't need a wedding license to remember. Sometimes, all it takes is the weight of a metal circle sewn into a seam. A circle never worn on the hand because he never asked. Some scholars trace these habits back to Roman and Byzantine traditions of wearing fibulae brooches over the heart, sometimes with inscriptions, but the medieval transformation of this custom turned it inward. What was once visible became hidden. What was once a badge became a secret. And maybe that's the deepest truth we're circling around here. Wedding rings are public. These tokens were private. And in that privacy, there was power. You didn't need to announce your marriage to the world. You just needed to remember it yourself. The touch of fabric, the scratch of parchment, the weight of a stone pressing gently against your ribs every time you inhaled. So you lie there now, listening to the hum of a fan, maybe feeling your own heartbeat under the blanket, and you wonder, what do you keep close to your chest? What secrets do you carry, pressed against your skin, known only to you? That's the question these women answered with every step they took. They didn't wait for someone else to put a ring on it. They made the vow real in silk, in ash, in silence. And you're starting to see it now, aren't you? How marriage real, lived. Often painful marriage wasn't always about declarations. It was about the quiet things, the things you carry, the things no one else notices, but you do. Every hour, every breath. Your fingers brush the edge of a sleeve and pause. Maybe it's the texture. Maybe it's the memory sewn into the fabric. In medieval Europe, you wouldn't need a ring to show you belonged to someone. You just needed a sleeve. Not your own, mind you, but his. The tradition of exchanging sleeves or cuffs, often embroidered or cut from a garment worn during the proposal, was an intimate and surprisingly binding gesture. In fact, in some regions, it was more meaningful than a ceremony itself, because when a man gave a woman the sleeve from his tunic, or more dramatically, when a woman cut it herself and tucked it under her gown, she wasn't just accepting a future, she was wearing it, carrying it, turning cloth into covenant. And no, this isn't just poetic exaggeration. There are documented instances, especially in the 13th and 14th centuries, of courts upholding the exchange of garments as evidence of betrothal. A sleeve was admissible, a vow, perhaps not. But a piece of wool stained with dye and sweat, that was proof. Sleeves were personal. Think about it, how many things do you touch with your arm? How many gestures start at the elbow and end in the fingertips? It's the sleeve that gathers heat from the skin, the sleeve that rubs against the table as you write or eat or pray. So when a woman accepted her lover's sleeve, she was holding something that had lived, something that carried traces of him, his scent, his labor, the way he moved. And if he had embroidered it himself, in clumsy but determined stitches, even better. That thread held intention. In some towns, especially along the Germanic rivers, a bride might receive not just a sleeve, but an entire garment fragment like a cuff or collar, carefully removed and folded. One particularly charming anecdote describes a young merchant who cut the sleeve from his only fine tunic and handed it to a shepherd girl beneath the town's stone bridge. She didn't smile, didn't say yes. She just wrapped it around her wrist and walked away. They were married 4 months later, quietly, without witnesses, but everyone remembered the sleeve. Historians still argue whether the sleeve tradition was influenced by knightly culture or older folk rituals. Some say it grew from courtly love traditions where ladies gifted knights favors ribbons or cloth tokens to tie onto spears or helmets before battle. Others believe it was even older, rooted in pre-Christian fertility customs, where cloth was symbolic of the womb and future life. Either way, the gesture lingered. From castles to cottages, sleeves whispered more than words. Sometimes the cloth was decorated. If you had money or time or both, you might embroider initials, symbols, or entire short messages. The classic Latin phrase, amor vincit omnia, love, conquers all, appears in surviving examples, stitched crookedly in faded red thread. One French woman stitched only a single dot onto the linen when asked. She said it was a tear she hadn't shed yet. You can't make that up. But you didn't always need to be sentimental. Some women accepted sleeves as literal contracts. One 15th century record from York details a woman who brought a man's embroidered cuff to court to argue that he'd promised marriage. The judge ruled in her favor, not because he believed the cuff was magical, but because, in that community, the giving of cloth had long-standing legal weight. A ring might be melted down or repurposed. A sleeve, stained and threadbare, was unmistakable. It could not be faked, and this exchange wasn't one way. Men received sleeves too, especially when a woman proposed, which, yes, happened more than you'd think. While the church frowned upon it, folk customs often allowed women to initiate betrothal through tokens. One Scottish tale describes a woman tying her sleeve to a man's walking staff as a way of claiming him. If he returned the sleeve, he declined. If he tied it around his wrist, they were engaged. No ring, just cloth and commitment. Even garments themselves became metaphors. To be sewn to someone's hem was a phrase meaning deep attachment, loyalty, not just in love, but in action. And in Icelandic folklore, there's a belief that if you embroidered someone's name into the inner hem of your gown and wore it for 7 days without speaking their name aloud, they'd dream of you, witchy maybe, but in an age where dreams mattered more than diaries, it worked. In many households, the first shared household item wasn't a bed, it was a shirt. Newly betrothed couples might co-mend a garment, each sewing a part of it to symbolically weave their lives together. One needle passed between them, with one thread running continuously through both hands. Some say this act was more binding than a priest's words, because when your fingers tremble and your stitch slips, and the person across from you steadies your hand without saying a word, that's marriage. A quirky variation emerged among traveling performers and merchant families. Instead of cloth, they exchanged ribbon knots. The bride would tie a colorful ribbon around the groom's sleeve, while he would give her a coin tied in fabric, worn on her upper arm. The combination of fabric and metal was said to bring both tenderness and fortune. If either token was lost before the wedding, the match was considered cursed. No pressure. Right. And let's not forget the tactile intimacy of this whole thing. To hold someone's sleeve is to reach for them without grasping too hard. To wear it is to trust that they'll come back. There's something breathtakingly fragile about wrapping a frayed piece of wool around your wrist and calling it a vow. No sparkle, no clasp, just fabric and faith. Some women never removed the cloth. They wore it until it faded into their own garments, until threads tangled and meanings blurred. There's a story from Bohemia about a widow who kept her husband's sleeve in her bodice for 20 years. She never remarried. When she died, they found it sewn into the lining of her apron, with his name barely legible in faded blue thread. They buried it with her, not because anyone told them to, but because everyone understood. The sleeve wasn't just a promise, it was presence, a way of saying you're with me, even when you're not. You see, rings are public. They sparkle, they invite questions, they require cleaning, but a sleeve worn quietly, held secretly, was a private, stubborn kind of devotion. So tonight, as you settle into the folds of your blanket, think about the fabric that's touched you, the clothes you've kept, the shirt you still have, even though the person is long gone. Maybe it's not so different. Maybe we still carry sleeves just under different names, and maybe love still stains, even if we don't see it right away. You tilt your head, imagining it, maybe even wincing a little because this next one sounds like something out of a fever dream. A string of children's milk teeth, worn around the neck like a charm, passed from one generation of women to the next. You don't expect that. Do you? You expect pearls, perhaps, maybe coral or amber beads, but teeth. In several remote villages across early medieval Europe, especially in the Carpathians and Baltic regions, women used what was available. And sometimes what was available was both deeply symbolic and slightly unsettling. A necklace of milk teeth, those little rootless symbols of life's first surrender, wasn't worn for shock value. It was worn to honor cycles, fertility, nourishment, and above all, permanence within impermanence. Historians still argue whether this practice was more magical than marital, but in communities where oral culture reigned, and bodies told stories long before ink did, a strand of small teeth could say more than a sermon. The belief was that a woman who wore the teeth of her own children, especially boys, would carry their strength with her, reinforcing her status as a wife and a mother. Not just a wife in the eyes of the church, but in the eyes of the land, of the seasons, of the very bones beneath her house. These weren't trinkets, they were talismans. Each tiny tooth represented pain survived, a birth, a fever, a sleepless night. She wasn't just showing that she'd raised children, she was showing that she'd bled for them. And that blood, in turn, sealed her place in the lineage of women before her. Of course, for those who hadn't yet had children, the token changed. In some areas, particularly near the Black Sea, young brides received freshwater pearl strands that were deliberately left incomplete. A necklace with only 6 or 7 pearls signaled a hope for fertility, each pearl representing a child to come. When a child was born, the woman or her midwife would add another pearl, if one could be found. If not, they substituted a bead of bone, clay, or even ash. The necklace became a kind of diary, worn at the throat, close to the voice that had sung lullabies, cried in pain, whispered promises at the edge of sleep. And yes, some men found this strange. One medieval bishop wrote a scathing letter to a group of women near Krakow, chastising them for wearing the tokens of beasts, and suggesting that any use of body parts, teeth, hair, nails, was pagan and therefore punishable by penance. But of course, the more the church railed against it, the more fiercely the tradition held on, because the women knew something the bishop didn't, that motherhood and wifehood weren't things you proved with sermons, you proved them with survival. One story survives from a Lithuanian forest village, where a woman, newly married, wore a necklace of her own baby teeth, saved by her mother, who had worn them in her own youth. When her first daughter was born, she added a single pebble to the strand, saying she didn't want to take any of the child's body just yet. Let her keep her roots a little longer, she said. And years later, when that child grew, she added her first lost tooth to the necklace herself, threading it with a dull copper wire while her mother looked on, crying softly into her apron. These weren't ornaments. These were stories, strung bead by bead. You might be asking, wasn't this unhygienic? Technically, yes, but so was life. And before you judge, remember people have always used what they have to mark what matters. In some areas of Wales and Brittany, children's teeth were dipped in beeswax and then painted with crushed flower petals to add color, creating a kind of natural enamel. The resulting pearls were pale, soft, and worn with reverence. No one was trying to impress the neighbors. They were trying to remember. Even outside the family, teeth and pearls carried layered meanings. In some seafaring communities, men gifted their brides with small nets filled with shells, stones, and yes, the occasional tooth animal or otherwise. The logic? These were tokens from the edge of the world, items pulled from the sea, from the hunt, from the places where death and sustenance met. To give these was to say, I've gone out into danger and returned for you. Romantic. Maybe not in the classical sense, but undeniably powerful. One fringe theory links these bone and pearl traditions to the Norse concept of hugr, a kind of soul essence believed to linger in the body's remnants. By wearing part of someone's former body, a child's tooth, a husband's lost molar after a brawl, you kept a piece of their hugger with you. Protective, anchoring, and maybe a little unnerving. But in a world where survival was never guaranteed, superstition wasn't just tolerated, it was woven into daily life. Let's talk about the sound, because it wasn't just visual. A string of small teeth makes a sound, a soft click, a hush of bone against bone. In the right silence, it's almost like wind chimes, whispering reminders with every step. One traveler's diary from 1312 mentions a woman whose necklace clicked like tiny bones knocking gently in conversation. He didn't mean it as a compliment, but the image lingers. And then there were the contrasts. Some women, particularly those with access to trade routes, combined ivory, bone, and pearl with bits of amber or coral. These weren't matched sets. They were jumbled, asymmetrical, telling stories not in symmetry, but in survival. One bead for the child who lived, one for the child who didn't, one from a sister who married young, one stolen from a rosary at a shrine in a moment of desperation. Nothing was random, nothing was pretty, but everything meant. Even the knots between the beads mattered. One superstition said that An odd number of knots meant the marriage would last longer. Another said that the necklace should never be worn on Sundays, unless the husband was traveling otherwise. The love would grow restless. You don't make this stuff up. You inherit it. What about those who couldn't afford beads or teeth or tokens? They drew them with charcoal or ash or a sharp stick in the dirt. One woman in a 14th century Czech village reportedly drew a new bead shape on her apron hem. Every time she bled for a child lost or born, her apron had 17 tiny circles stitched in gray by the time she died. Her neighbors knew what they meant. They didn't speak of it. They didn't need to. You start to see it, don't you? The ring has always been too neat, too simple. These medieval women wore stories around their necks. They carried life and death, hope and loss, all suspended by fragile thread or knotted flax. A ring might gleam, but it doesn't rattle like teeth. It doesn't remind you with every movement that love is messy, bone deep, and sometimes painful to carry. So tonight, as the quiet deepens and your breath slows, imagine reaching under your collar and touching something smooth, curved, a little too small to belong to you now. Imagine the faint clicking, the tug at your neck. Not a ring, not a chain, but something older, something earned. A reminder that love, at its rawest, isn't about shine. It's about holding the evidence of life lived right next to your heart. Your tongue touches the back of your teeth, as if checking they're all still there, and suddenly, the idea of using salt and bread as wedding tokens seems almost gentle, almost sane. Compared to braids and bones and tooth charms, the act of breaking bread together feels humble, maybe even modern. But don't be fooled. In medieval homes, especially the ones without pews or pewter, salt and bread weren't snacks. They were sacred. To eat salted bread with someone, especially in front of others, was a declaration. It meant alliance. It meant shared burden. And if the bread was broken during a betrothal, or before a bed was shared, it meant marriage. Done. No documents. No witnesses required. Just crumbs and saliva and the quiet ritual of survival made intimate. It happened in kitchens, in fields, on the backs of carts. The bread didn't have to be fancy sometimes. It was barely more than flour and ash, blackened at the edges, wrapped in a cloth that still smelled like smoke. The salt, if it was there at all, was pinched between calloused fingers or ground from a precious, hoarded lump. That was the currency of union. No gold, no silver, just sustenance shared, chewed, and swallowed in silence. In parts of medieval Poland and Bohemia, there was a custom where a woman would knead dough on the morning of her betrothal, pressing her thumb into the center of the loaf before it rose. When it came out of the fire, she'd break it with her own hands, no knife allowed, and offer the thumbprint piece to the man. If he ate it, they were bound. If he refused, she kept the loaf and the shame. Historians still argue whether this was a folk custom or a domestic superstition, but the records, spotty as they are, keep repeating one word: binding. Salt itself carried layers of symbolism. In a world without refrigeration, salt preserved life. It prevented decay. To eat salt with someone was to say, "I trust you not to rot. I trust you to stay." One Italian proverb from the 1300s said, "He who has shared salt cannot raise his hand in betrayal." Whether that was true or not, it was believed. And belief, in a marriage, is often the glue. There's a curious example from the early Frankish world, a tiny village near what's now Rams, where a couple who couldn't afford a priest simply stood on either side of a table and dipped the same piece of bread into a bowl of salted wine. No vows, just eyes locked and fingers wet with the same brine. They lived together for 20 years, raised 6 children, and when the man died, the woman placed a crust of bread in his hands before burial. That was her ring. In the Scottish Highlands, the tradition was even rougher. A woman would bake an oat cake and hide a piece of rock salt inside. She'd then break the cake in half and offer the lumpy side to her intended. If he ate it without complaint, even with a sharp crunch of salt in his teeth, it meant he could endure the hardships of married life. If he spat it out, the match was off. No negotiations. The salt was the test. Marriage, after all, was less about sweetness and more about grit. Even in urban centers, Like medieval London or Bruges, bread-sharing rituals persisted. One surviving ledger from a London innkeeper in the late 1200s records multiple instances of salt loaf pledging, a term used when travelers or lovers shared food to mark an agreement. One entry reads Thomas the Cartwright and Eleanor of the Mill, bound by loaf, evening bell. That's it. No signature. Just a crumb trail leading into domestic obscurity. And yes, you guessed it, there were debates. The church wasn't thrilled. Salt and bread, they argued, were sacred metaphors for communion, not marriage. Using them to seal a union, especially outside of church walls, was an affront to the sacraments. But people weren't concerned with theological neatness. They were concerned with hunger, with habit, with handing someone a crust and seeing whether they'd take it without flinching. That said more than a Latin vow ever could. Some even took it a step further. In Alpine regions, couples would bake marriage loaves together, round, thick, scored with runes or initials. The woman's hands pressed the left side, the man's the right. After baking, the couple would each take a bite from their side and then swap the remaining halves. If the bread didn't crack or burn unevenly, the match was considered blessed. If it split or slumped, omen. One recorded legend tells of a young woman who burned the loaf on her side 3 times in a row. She married him anyway. He left within a year. The village remembered the bread. You start to notice the sensuality in these customs. The act of tearing, biting, swallowing. The mouth becomes the vessel of union. Not the finger, not the wrist. The mouth where words are born, where promises are whispered, where hunger meets its end. To eat together, in this context, is to marry the body before you marry the soul. One woman from a 15th century Czech village reportedly carried a piece of her wedding bread in her apron pocket for years. She'd nibble it every time she argued with her husband, a kind of edible reminder that she had once accepted him willingly. When she died, it was still there, crumbled and dry, but intact. A historian who catalogued her burial described it as the last morsel of consent. That's haunting, and also oddly comforting. Even salt itself was sometimes worn, in tiny cloth pouches or stitched into belt linings. Brides might receive a grain of salt in their shoe, a symbol that marriage would always be a walk with weight. And if you think that sounds like a metaphor your grandmother would love, you're probably right. These women weren't just sentimental. They were strategic. They embedded memory into daily life. They made it impossible to forget. Sometimes the rituals turned playful. In certain Baltic villages, a bride would hide a salted biscuit in her sleeve and offer it to her groom after their first dance. If he ate it without asking, it meant he trusted her completely. If he paused, trouble. It sounds like a party game now. Back then, it was the whole truth, baked and salted. But perhaps the quietest, most powerful aspect of this bread and salt ritual was its domestic nature. It didn't need an audience. It happened in kitchens, at hearths, on damp wooden tables scratched with years of other stories. Marriage wasn't about spectacle. It was about sustenance. A shared bite, a nod, a quiet agreement, chewed and swallowed. So tonight, as you think about modern weddings and diamond rings and all the sparkle that fills your feed, remember the couples who just had a loaf between them, who didn't need approval or applause, just salt, bread, and the quiet sound of 2 lives breaking something open together and calling that act holy. You shift in your seat, maybe glance toward your bedpost without meaning to, and now you're wondering what if love was knotted, literally, to the place you sleep in many corners of medieval Europe. That's exactly how marriage began. Not with vows in a chapel or rings exchanged beneath a painted ceiling, but with cords tied to a bedpost, sometimes simple, sometimes elaborate, always deliberate. These weren't just decorative threads. They were declarations. A couple would enter a shared space, stand by the bed, and tie cords in silence, sometimes in loops, sometimes in careful knots that would stay fast through the night, the month, or even the first year. And those knots, they mattered more than words. Historians still argue whether these bedpost bindings had legal significance or purely symbolic weight, but one thing is certain, they held meaning. In a world where marriage was often more private than public, the bedpost bore witness. In regions like Brittany, Flanders, and parts of Saxony, It was common for the couple's hands to be bound first with flax, hemp, or red-dyed wool, and then to tie that same cord to a carved notch in the bedpost. The idea was that love wasn't just about consent, it was about tethering to each other, to a home, to a life now shared in sleep and waking. A woman might tie the knot with 3 loops to symbolize birth, harvest, and death. A man might add a small wooden charm to the cord, a carved leaf, a bird, or even a tiny likeness of his bride. No witnesses were needed. The bed was the altar. The knots were the vows. One German folktale tells of a bride who braided her hair into the cord before tying it to the post, saying, "If you leave, you take me with you." It wasn't meant as a threat. It was a promise that wherever her husband slept, part of her would remain threaded, knotted, undeniable. And this wasn't just a rural practice. In some noble houses, ornate marriage cords were embroidered with family crests or protective symbols and tied to 4-poster beds with ceremonial formality. In one Spanish estate inventory from the 1470s, a cord made of red silk, pearls, and gold thread is listed under items necessary for the joining of spouses. Not jewelry, not a scroll, a cord. The act of tying had layers. In some cultures, like the Welsh borderlands, couples tied one knot for every promise they made: loyalty, protection, labor, fertility, companionship, and so on. If a promise was broken, the knot was untied. But untying wasn't simple. One wife, recorded in a village tale, claimed her husband broke their 4th knot, the one tied for fidelity, and when he tried to undo it physically, the cord tangled around his wrist and burned. Poetic justice. Probably, but these people believed in the weight of thread. There's even evidence that some cords were burned after consummation placed into the hearth as a way of sealing the bond with flame. Ashes were then collected and buried beneath the doorstep of the couple's home. In that way, the marriage quite literally became part of the house's foundation. You didn't just live there, your promise did too. One fringe theory suggests that the location of the knot on the bedpost had specific meanings. A knot on the left meant protection, one on the right meant fertility. Center top was for long life. Center bottom, well, let's just say that one was tied with a smirk and a wink. And couples could tie all 4 if they were feeling especially ambitious. It wasn't just about intention. It was about direction anchoring invisible hopes to physical space. There's a story from a rural village in Languedoc, where a widow returned to her childhood home and found her parents' marriage cord still tied, brittle but intact, under the bed frame. She untied it gently and wore it as a belt until her own death. That kind of devotion doesn't sparkle. It frays. It stains. But it endures. Even travelers and tradespeople had portable versions. Sailors would carry knotted cords from their wives or lovers, tied with a drop of wax or stitched with a single initial. Some tied these cords to the inside of their sea chests or hung them beneath bunks. If they returned home with the cord still whole, it was seen as a sign of faithfulness. If it snapped during the voyage, omen. And of course, there were couples who took it further. One German text from the 13th century references knots of renewal ceremonial bindings, tied again each year on the wedding night anniversary. The same bed, the same post, the same cord, or what remained of it. A new knot for a new year. A private, wordless way of saying, we're still here. Sometimes children were included in the ritual. A couple expecting their first child might tie a second cord, thinner, dyed blue or green, to the original one, symbolizing the next life tied to theirs. There's something humbling about that image. A newborn cradled between 2 parents who sleep beside a cord they tied in hope, in fear, in hunger, in love. Church authorities had mixed feelings. Some clergymen dismissed the practice as superstitious or indecent, tying things to beds smacked too much of folk magic, but others, especially in rural parishes, quietly accepted it. After all, it kept marriages together, and it required no Latin, no license, just string and memory. You can almost see it now, can't you? A small room, a low ceiling, a straw mattress. The couple stands side by side, their fingers fumbling with the woolen cord, whispering to each other in the dark. No audience, no applause, just the soft rasp of thread against wood. That's the sound of love, friction, and faith. bound together. In modern weddings, there are echoes of this. Hand-fasting ceremonies have made a comeback, often wrapped in pastel ribbons and filtered through Instagram-friendly rituals. But the medieval version was different, earthier, riskier. You tied your fate to someone in a room no one else entered, and you slept beside the evidence every night. And you're starting to feel it, aren't you? The gravity of these forgotten vows. The way a simple cord, once tied, could mark a life more deeply than gold ever could. Because gold shines, but it doesn't hold. Thread does. It binds. It frays with you. It remembers. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, picture a single knot on your bedpost, one loop, one twist, tied in silence, and imagine that every dream you have is anchored to that knot, held steady by the hands that tied it. That's what marriage looked like for thousands of women before rings. Not perfect, not permanent, but real, and tied where it mattered most. You don't really expect the graveyard to be part of a love story, do you? But in the medieval world, death wasn't separate from marriage. It stood beside it, whispered into it, sometimes even blessed it. And for some women, the most binding wedding tokens didn't come from a lover's hands at all. They came from the dead. No, not in the ghostly, gothic sense you're imagining, but in a quieter, eerier, altogether more intimate way. In rural regions of Eastern Europe, Northern Italy, and even scattered across isolated parts of England and Ireland, women carried charms made from graveyard soil, bone fragments, and even the braided hair of ancestors. These weren't morbid accessories. They were protection, legacy, and memory made physical. A woman would tuck a scrap of her grandmother's hair into her bodice, or wear a pouch of earth gathered from a relative's grave tied to her belt. Why? Because marriage wasn't just between two people. It was a conversation with the dead. Historians still argue whether these practices were remnants of pre-Christian ancestor worship or merely folk expressions of continuity, but the truth, as always, lies in both. In one tradition from the Carpathian region, a bride would kneel on her family's burial ground the night before her wedding, bearing a small piece of cloth from her childhood dress under the soil. This wasn't superstition, it was invitation. The ancestors were being asked to witness, to approve, and sometimes to warn. If she dreamed of a weeping face that night, the wedding was delayed. If she dreamed of a smiling one, the match was blessed. One recorded case in 1311 from a village near Milan tells of a woman who wore a pendant made from her mother's tooth, polished and wrapped in linen. She claimed it brought her clarity and courage. The church called it blasphemy, but the local priest quietly blessed her marriage anyway, likely aware that traditions like these weren't sins. They were memory, hardened into ritual. There's even a haunting little practice among certain Gaelic-speaking communities bearing a tiny, carved love token, often a stone or piece of metal, beside the grave of a long-dead couple known to have had a faithful marriage. The idea was to root your own union into soil that had already held love. This was sometimes done secretly, at dusk, and more than once, a priest or local authority tried to discourage the ritual, calling it romantic necromancy. But the women continued. You can't shame what you understand better than law. Even graveyard flowers had meaning. A bride might gather heather or yarrow from a family grave and weave it into her braid, binding the wisdom of the past into the hair she offered her new life. In a surviving folk song from Wales, a girl sings, "I take no gold, I take no pearl, only soil from my mother's world." Simple, wistful, more binding than vows. And while you might recoil at the idea of carrying bone or soil as a love token, consider this: these women weren't obsessed with death. They just weren't afraid of it. They knew that any union built without memory would not survive the winter. Marriage wasn't a clean slate, it was a continuation. And to carry the remnants of the dead into the arms of the living wasn't grim, it was grounding. Some tokens were even more tactile. A few accounts describe women tying tiny fragments of bone, sometimes animal, sometimes human, into the hems of their dresses. The bones were chosen carefully. A bird's bone for freedom, a lamb's for gentleness. A child's often taken from a saint's reliquary, not a relative's grave for protection. One woman was said to have worn a rabbit's foot carved from her stillborn sister's burial offering. You read that and feel a chill. But for her, it was love, shaped by loss. She wasn't trying to frighten anyone. She was trying to hold what little she could. In Central Europe, there were even grave belt sashes woven with threads that had been soaked in holy water and dried on gravestones. These belts were worn under clothing, never shown, and believed to bring endurance during childbirth, fidelity in the home, and luck in surviving the first harsh winter as a wife. It wasn't about magic. It was about making memory wearable. Men participated too. Some grooms buried a strand of their betrothed's hair on the grave of a beloved ancestor, promising to care for her as you once cared for me. In regions where grandfathers were household authorities, this ritual passed the patriarchal torch with a nod to the beyond. One French diary entry from 1376 mentions a man who left 3 drops of wine and a kiss of linen on his grandfather's grave before his wedding. The linen, historians believe, was from his future wife's sleeve, a symbolic gesture of shared blood, past and future. Fringe theories even suggest that wedding beds were sometimes blessed with grave dust sprinkled into the corners to quiet wandering spirits and anchor the new marriage in settled ground. It's debated, of course. No bride likely admitted to it openly, but among midwives and older women, the whispers survive. And let's not forget the role of dreams. One tale from Estonia tells of a bride who buried a silver bead on her father's grave the night before her wedding, asking for his blessing. That night she dreamed of fire, but no pain, just warmth, and a voice that said, "Tie your knots with clean hands." She awoke sobbing, washed her hands in cold rain, and walked to the wedding barefoot. No ring, just clarity. The church always had a conflicted relationship with these customs. It wanted control over marriage rights, but couldn't compete with the intimacy of dirt under the fingernails and ash stitched into a sleeve. Over time, some clerics tried to incorporate ancestor blessings into the liturgy, but the rawness never translated well into Latin. So these traditions stayed quiet, practiced at twilight, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, never written, only remembered. And you feel it now, don't you? This strange tenderness for rituals the world would call unsettling. But there's a strange honesty in saying, I carry the dead with me into this union. Because the truth is, you do. We all do. Every love is shadowed by others. Every vow echoes someone else's silence. These tokens just made that visible. So tonight, as the room grows still and your thoughts wander, picture the soft hush of soil poured into a cloth pouch. Picture a lock of white hair wrapped around a bone charm, hidden under layers of fabric, not because it's frightening, but because it's faithful, because it means you never walk into love alone. Someone, somewhere, always walks with you. You place a hand lightly on your waist, maybe without meaning to, and if you lived centuries ago, that motion might have brushed against more than fabric. It might have touched the one thing that told the world you were married a belt, not jeweled, not ornamental, but woolen, hand-woven, and sacred. In many medieval societies, especially across Scandinavia, the Baltic, and Anglo-Saxon England, a belt was more than an accessory. It was a boundary, a symbol, a signal. When a woman wore the belt of faithfulness, she wasn't just showing her status, she was carrying a vow. And unlike a ring, the belt couldn't be hidden by a glove or lost in a basin. It wrapped around her body every day, tightening with each breath, cinched by hands that had spun the wool, dyed the threads, and whispered hopes into the weave. The tradition wasn't uniform. In some regions, the belt was a gift from the groom. In others, it was made by the bride's mother and handed over the morning of the wedding with a blessing sometimes mumbled, sometimes sung, often involving old words no one translated anymore. Historians still argue whether these belts were purely symbolic or if they once held legal significance, like a dowry marker or a claim of chastity. But what's clear is that these belts weren't passive objects. They meant something. They held the weight of a household. A woman tied hers not just around her hips, but around her future. They were simple things, flat bands of wool or linen, about 2 or 3 fingers wide, often dyed in earthy tones, rust red, deep green, soft ochre. Some had beads or charms sewn into the hem, usually in odd numbers for luck. Others bore runic or embroidered inscriptions, "Keep my house, in faith we rise." Her hands are never empty. They weren't flashy. They were personal. And they told a story stitched, not spoken. There's a particularly moving tale from a small village in western Finland, where a mother gave her daughter a woven belt with 5 knots tied into the inside lining. Each knot, she said, held a part of the girl's name, her real name, the one no one used aloud, the one whispered only in times of danger or childbirth. As long as these knots stay tied, the mother said, your home will hold. The daughter wore that belt every day until it frayed into strands. When her own child was born, she used those threads to braid a new one. Nothing was wasted. Every fiber was memory. Some belts were hidden beneath layers of clothing, but others were displayed proudly, slung low over the hips or tied with long tassels that brushed against the thighs. In German-speaking regions, a woman might add bells to the belt, small ones. Not enough to jingle constantly, but just enough to mark her presence in a room. Not for vanity, for recognition. Here is the wife. She carries the hearth. A fringe custom from early Anglo-Saxon England involved the locking of a belt on the wedding night. Not the crude chastity belt myth you've heard in Renaissance fair jokes, but a symbolic act. The bride would tie a belt around her waist, and only her husband, using a small wooden key given in private, could untie it. The key was often carved in the shape of a tree, an animal, or the sun's symbols of life. Not ownership. The point wasn't control. It was consent. The belt was a barrier until she chose to open it. In Slavic lands, especially among peasant communities, the belt was woven communally. Neighboring women, aunts, cousins, would all contribute a few threads to the loom, humming as they worked. The bride would stand barefoot while they passed the shuttle, each woman adding her own blessing into the rhythm. One would wish her many children, another, strong hands, another, patience for long winters. The result, a belt too powerful to ever be bought. And they weren't just worn, they were used, tied around the waists of infants to protect them from fever, wrapped around bread loaves during storms to bless the grain, coiled under pillows on nights when the marriage was strained. As if the belt could hold more than just flesh, it could hold silence, anger, and eventually, peace. Some belts had pockets sewn into them, tiny ones, where women kept charms, herbs, or even teeth from lost infants. One Icelandic woman was known to carry a dried piece of seaweed in hers, saying it was the first thing her husband gave her when they met by the shore. That was his ring, she'd joke, patting the pouch, still salty, too. There's a recorded account from 1420 in a Danish village of a woman who wore her mother's belt, her grandmother's charms sewn into the lining, and her own added knot near the buckle. When she died, the belt was split into pieces and given to her daughters not buried, but continued. Each fragment a lineage, each thread a name unspoken. And yes, the church tried to co-opt the belt, like it did with so many folk practices. Some priests declared that only chaste girdles blessed by clergy could be worn at weddings. They stamped them with holy wax and offered printed prayers to be tucked beneath the knots. But most women preferred the old way. The wool their mothers spun, the thread dyed in backyard kettles, the rituals done in kitchens, not sanctuaries, because this was their magic, not borrowed, not blessed, just earned, spun between fingers, warmed on thighs, tied with a breath and worn into marriage like armor. And unlike a ring, the belt could stretch, could tighten, could fray with childbirth and be knotted again after loss. It moved with the body, with the years, with the changing weight of marriage itself. Think about that. A ring stays the same, no matter what. But a belt adapts. It carries the fluctuations, the pulls, the loosenings and retightenings of a real life. So tonight, lie still for a moment and imagine a strip of wool wrapped snug around your waist. Not glamorous, not golden, but full of weight, full of promises, threads from hands that fed you, soothed you, warned you. Imagine pulling it tight one last time before stepping into the dark with someone else. That's how you married in the time before rings, with fabric that remembered your name. You reach toward your hand instinctively now, maybe brushing your thumb along your finger, half expecting to feel a ring there, but in much of medieval life, that finger remained bare, or if not bare, then circled by something that didn't gleam. Because when rings were used, and they weren't always gold, and they certainly weren't diamonds. They were wooden circles carved from cherry bark, or rough bands hammered from iron, already rusting before they even touched the skin. These weren't symbols of wealth. They were markers of promise. A ring, yes, but a ring that stained, cracked, even splintered. Historians still argue whether these humble rings served a purely symbolic function, or whether they also indicated dowry fulfillment or community recognition. But for many, the truth was simple. If you couldn't afford gold, you carved love from what you had. In England, particularly among laborers and lower-ranking guild workers, a cherrywood ring was a common engagement gesture. The bark, if left untreated, would peel within weeks, but if it was boiled and rubbed with tallow, it could last through the season, and maybe, if luck was with you, even longer. One tale from rural Yorkshire tells of a man who carved a ring for his bride-to-be during a night watch in a sheepfold. The inside bore a single scratched word, "Stay." She wore it for years, long after it had cracked into two halves, tied together with thread. She didn't remove it, even when they had enough coin for something better. It broke, but we didn't, she told their granddaughter once. Iron rings were more common among blacksmith families or towns near working forges. Crude, sometimes jagged, and often prone to rusting. These rings weren't tokens of luxury, they were forged in fire, then plunged into water, cooled with urgency, worn with pride. Some were stamped with initials using nail heads. Others were smooth, dark loops that rubbed raw against the skin until the body adjusted. A red mark on the finger was not a flaw. It was the sign that something had been claimed, even if not polished. There's a curious detail from an old Flemish guild record. Apprentices were not allowed to give rings until their training was complete. So many carved them from softwood or bone in the meantime, hoping the gesture would buy time until their wages could buy metal. One apprentice named Willem gave his beloved a ring carved from ox bone, etched with a heart and 3 stars. When he returned 2 years later with a forged iron band, she still wore the first on a cord around her neck. She told him she preferred the one made by hands that missed me. In Baltic regions, rings were sometimes made from braided horsehair or strips of birch bark, soaked in water and pressed into tight coils. These organic rings would wear down slowly, absorbing the oils from the skin, changing color over time, growing darker with age. A woman who kept such a ring for 10 years might find it nearly black by the end, but she wore that darkness like an honor. After all, what was marriage but the act of letting time mark you? In Norway, there was a tradition of crafting snow rings, temporary bands made from tightly rolled wool, dipped in lard and left to dry. They weren't meant to last. They were meant to start, to represent that even if you had nothing now, you intended to build something lasting. Sometimes the bride would keep the ring in a pouch once it frayed, and if she had daughters, she'd show it to them when they came of age, not as a lesson, but as a reminder that you didn't need wealth to promise truth. And then came the iron rings etched with symbols, crosses, leaves, moon's marks that could be scratched into the surface with a knife. These rings were often gifted in secret, especially when marriages weren't formally approved. A moon-shaped mark suggested waiting. A leaf growth, a cross, though religious, often signaled sacrifice rather than piety. "I give you my struggle," it said, not a gem. One preserved ring from 13th century Italy bears a single dot, so small it might be mistaken for a flaw, but scholars believe it represents a child wanted or lost. Rings were memory, after all, and the rougher they were, the more they remembered. The church one, of course, wanted to regulate rings. Eventually, gold became the preferred metal for weddings in elite and ecclesiastical circles, with bishops insisting that only gold was pure enough to signify divine union. But the people resisted. In small towns and farms, iron remained a badge of sincerity. There's a story of a blacksmith who forged his own wedding ring, stamping it with a sun on one side and a hammer on the other. When the local priest protested its lack of preciousness, the bride said, "It carries more heat than your gold ever did." The ceremony proceeded quietly. In some regions, there were ghost rings that left marks but had no mass. In Ireland, a woman might twist a loop of grass around her finger and sleep with it there for 7 nights. If it stayed whole, it meant her vow was strong. If it broke, she'd rethink her match. A mark without a ring was still a ring. Proof didn't need metal, it needed meaning. Children, too, played a role. In Slavic weddings, it was common for the youngest child of the bride's family to carry the ring not on a pillow, but inside a woolen pouch, swinging from a belt. That ring, sometimes wooden, sometimes brass, might be dropped, stepped on, or kissed. The child wasn't there for show. They were the future, holding the circle that promised it. Some rings were made of glass, rare, fragile, often imported, but chosen deliberately by lovers who wanted to show that marriage was delicate, that it could break, that it needed care. One broken glass ring, kept in a chest in Bohemia, is said to have shattered on the night its wearer miscarried. She kept the shards in a cloth for years, not because she mourned, but because she remembered. Even the act of making the ring could be a vow. In the Orkney Isles, couples would sit together and braid thin strips of leather into loops, whispering promises with each turn. No one else was allowed to hear. The ring wasn't shown. It was worn only when they were alone, in bed or at sea. A private circle, unseen but intact. So no, these weren't rings you'd find in a velvet box. They didn't shine. They didn't cost much. They didn't make you gasp when opened. But they carried time. They carried fingerprints, stains, sweat, and splinters. They aged with the body and broke with the heart. And now, as you glance again at your own hand, maybe wearing something sleek and polished, you wonder what it would mean to wear a ring that never left your skin unmarked. A ring that clung to you like bark, like rust, like promise without polish. That was love. Once, a loop of cherry wood, a band of iron, a braid of hair, circles, yes, but imperfect ones. And maybe, because of that, they held. You flex your fingers, almost as if they remember something tactile, ceremonial, older than the gold band you might wear today. But imagine this instead of a ring slipped onto your finger. Someone places a glove in your palm, just one, not both. A soft gesture, and suddenly, you are spoken for. In parts of medieval Europe, particularly in cities where commerce and heraldry intertwined, Bruges, Antwerp, and sections of southern England, marriage was sometimes sealed not with a ring, but with a glove stitched with a family crest, or one plucked directly from the hand of the betrothed and pressed, not worn, into the hand of their future spouse. It wasn't a grand performance, it was a transaction of trust, and it meant, I give you my hand. In every sense of the word, you didn't have to wear the glove. You had to carry it. The promise wasn't about adornment, it was about weight. In early civic records from London and parts of Normandy, the phrase marriage by glove appears occasionally, often next to notations involving trade guilds or land transfers. Historians still argue whether this glove ritual was legally binding or merely symbolic. Some claim it evolved from merchant customs. Others believe it began with feudal oaths. But for the people enacting it, the glove wasn't just cloth and stitching, it was a stand-in for the person. To carry their glove was to carry their name, their livelihood, their intention. It was their hand, extended across time and absence. One particularly vivid account from 14th century Bruges describes a young man, a tailor's son, who presented his bride-to-be with a glove stitched from the offcuts of garments he'd sewn with his own hands. Each finger was a different fabric: velvet, linen, wool. She wore it under her sleeve on their wedding day, over her heart, and never took it off until it wore through. When it finally tore at the thumb, she wrapped it in linen and buried it in the hearth ashes, saying only, "That was the day he offered me everything." In regions where social class defined who could wear what, the glove became a way for the working class to claim ceremony without cost. A ring required gold. A glove required only labor, and sometimes, that labor made the vow deeper. A fisherman might give his bride a glove stitched from sailcloth. A shepherd might present a lambskin glove with his initials scratched in charcoal inside. These weren't grand gestures. They were lived ones, and it wasn't always men giving gloves to women. In certain traditions, especially among cloth merchants and guild wives, the woman gave the glove, not just any glove, but one worn during her work, softened with her effort. One story from Bristol tells of a woman who ran a market stall selling herbs and thread. She gave her future husband a glove dyed green from the sage she bundled daily. He never cleaned it. I want it to smell like her hands, he told a friend. You might imagine gloves as pristine, delicate things, but not these. They were stained, calloused, sewn roughly, sometimes by candlelight. One might have fingers too long, another a thumb turned awkwardly at the seam. But that imperfection was the point. A glove was not about perfection, it was about presence. There were even superstitions about glove material: linen for loyalty, leather for endurance, wool for warmth of body and of temperament. If a glove was patched, it meant the marriage would withstand hardship. If it frayed too early, it was taken as a warning. In some circles, people believed that washing a marriage glove too soon would wash away the bond, so they stayed dirty, and somehow more real. Glove exchanges happened in quiet places, in stables, kitchens, or markets' never grand halls. A woman might pull off her glove while haggling and hand it to the man she'd chosen. He would nod, tuck it into his tunic, and the matter would be considered settled. The villagers would whisper they'd noticed. The priest might pretend he hadn't, but the promise was made. In some towns, gloves were displayed before the marriage, pinned to doors or hung on strings outside windows. One glove for each promise kept, one glove for each year waited. A tailor's widow in Ghent reportedly strung 8 gloves along her shutter while waiting for a man she had loved since youth. When he returned, he added a child's glove at the end his sister's, who had died while he was gone. The wedding followed in winter, quiet, but no one forgot the line of gloves trembling in the wind. Guild customs further entwined the glove with status. Apprentices who completed their training were often given a ceremonial glove with the master's mark, which they'd sometimes pass on during their marriage as a way of tying personal worth to the union. One blacksmith carved a steel glove from flat iron, more of a loop than a wearable object. He presented it to his wife, saying, "This one doesn't bend, but I will." She wore it as a brooch for 30 years. Gloves also found their way into funerals. A woman buried with her husband's glove, tucked beneath her bodice, a glove left on a shared pillow, long after one half of the bed was cold. There's something unspeakably tender about an object made for touch being left behind, untouched, as testimony. In aristocratic circles, gloves could be elaborate fur-lined, beaded, scented with rosewater, but even then, their meaning lingered. One court record from Castile mentions a noblewoman who refused to remove her betrothal glove at a banquet, stating, "His hand is with me always." The ladies laughed, but they understood. In quieter corners, glove marriages continued well into the early modern period. In Scottish borderlands, lovers who couldn't legally marry would each bury a glove beneath the same tree, returning a year later to retrieve the others. If the gloves remained, they married. If only one remained, the absent party had walked away, or worse. And yes, the church tried to intervene. Gloves lacked witnesses. They were too private, too flexible, too real. But the people held on, because a glove wasn't sacred, because someone said it was. It was sacred because it had held you. So tonight, as you lay your hand to rest beside you, imagine feeling not a ring, but a glove, worn thin, stitched with care, warm with memory, not on your hand, but in it, folded, carried, believed in. Because sometimes, love doesn't wrap around your finger, it lies in your palm, soft and imperfect, and asks you not to wear it, but to hold it. You tilt your ear toward the sound of water, faint, imagined, but suddenly relevant because once upon a time, love was sworn not in chapels or crowded feasts, but beside a well. Not just any well, mind you, but a sacred one hidden behind the chapel, or nestled in the woods, or fed by a spring no one could quite trace. In medieval Europe, particularly in Celtic regions, parts of France, and remote corners of Wales and Ireland, these wells weren't just places for drinking or washing, they were places of vow, of whispers, of marriage. When a man and woman stood beside a well and made a promise, and if one dropped a coin or a pebble, or even just a feather, that vow was believed to bind them as tightly as any priest's words. Historians still argue whether these unions held legal weight, but in the eyes of the community, and often the lovers themselves, they were real, deeply real. Imagine the ritual: you walk with him, or he walks with you. No one else follows. The trees hush, the path narrows. The spring bubbles beneath stone, clear and cold and ancient. And one of you speaks not loudly, not formally, but with intent. I will keep you, or I will stay through frost, or simply you and no other. And then a coin, sometimes an old one, rubbed thin with age, is dropped in, not as payment, but as anchor. The sound it makes as it hits the water. That was your witness. That was your ring. In Scottish folklore, it's said that wells hear more truly than ears. A promise made to a spring couldn't be taken back. The water would remember, and if you broke your vow, the well would run dry, or worse, run red. Superstition, perhaps. But even skepticism bends when you're alone in nature, the cold seeping up your boots, your voice the only thing between silence and eternity. One story from 12th century Brittany tells of a couple who met at the same well every new moon for a year, each time dropping a single kernel of wheat into the water. On the 13th visit, the woman dropped a kernel carved with her initials. The man drank from the well, kissed her wrist, and they walked home together. That was the ceremony. They were never blessed by clergy, but they lived as husband and wife for decades. And when they died, they were buried with 2 small stones, smooth, water-worn, held between their palms. In some regions, the ritual involved more theatrics. A couple might circle the well 3 times before speaking their vows, or one would lean over, drop a cup of water, and offer it to the other. To drink was to agree. To sip and set the cup down was to postpone, to refuse. That was rejection, but a kind rejection. One where the water took the disappointment and kept it secret. These wells weren't necessarily marked on maps. They were spoken of quietly. A mother might tell her daughter, if you want to be sure, take him to the west field, near the hawthorn. The well there still listens. Or an old man might warn his son, don't promise by the stone spring unless you mean it. It remembers more than I do. This wasn't nostalgia. This was caution. And yes, there were cases where these unions caused trouble. In 1308, a woman in Aragon brought her lover to court, claiming he had wed her by the well of San Telmo, and now refused to live with her. The court asked if there had been a ring. She said no, but she swore she'd dropped 3 coins, and he had whispered, "You are mine." The judge was unmoved, but the villagers, reportedly, stopped speaking to the man. The well had heard. That was enough. The tokens dropped into wells varied. Coins were common. Yes, but so were things more personal. A thread from a sleeve, a tooth, a pebble marked with a name in berry juice. One woman famously dropped a small silver bell into a holy spring in Cornwall, claiming it would ring between us if ever we lie. A folklorist later tried to retrieve it. He found nothing. But the villagers still say the spring sounds different in the morning after a marriage has been broken. Fringe traditions claim that you could test fidelity at the well. If a woman returned alone, spoke her husband's name, and the water remained still, he was true. If it rippled, he had strayed. Of course, skeptics said a breeze could cause the same effect. But when you're desperate for certainty, even the wind feels like evidence. And in times of grief, the well was still the place to go. Widows would return and drop black cloth into the water, or a single stone from their doorstep, not as a new vow, but as a release, to let the spring carry the name, the sorrow, the ache. In some places, these women would never remarry, believing that the well still held their first promise, and no new one could overwrite it. Not all springs were solemn. Some were playful. In Central Ireland, a well known as Laughing Hollow was said to grant joyful marriages to couples who danced beside it under the moon. There's a tale of a shoemaker and a weaver who did just that, one of them in socks, the other barefoot. They slipped, fell in, and were soaked head to toe. They married the next day. It's said the well still bubbles harder every June, remembering their splash. Of course, as with all folk traditions, the church had thoughts. Wells were often co-opted, rededicated to saints, fenced off. Some priests blessed them with incense, trying to claim the memory of the water for Christ. But many villagers ignored the sermons and returned at dawn or dusk, when the clergy were asleep, because saints were good, but spring water, ancient and listening, was better. The idea that nature could bind you wasn't strange back then. It was obvious. The land fed you, the weather punished you, the river carried your waste, your hopes, your dead. Of course, the water could marry you. Who else had watched you so long, so quietly? One woman from a village in Provence wrote a single word on a leaf and floated it on the surface of the well. Her beloved did the same. When their leaves touched, they swore it was fate, they married. And when he died 10 years later, she placed another leaf in the water. This time it held 2 words, still yours. Even today, there are places where people toss coins into fountains, unaware that they are echoing something far older than Make-A-Wish games. They're whispering vows. They're practicing promises. Water listens still. So tonight, as your room settles into silence, close your eyes and picture a well. Stone-lined, mossy, cold. You kneel beside it, heart uncertain but hand steady. You drop something small into the dark, listening for the sound it makes as it disappears. There are no rings here, no paperwork, just water and the echo of your own voice, making a promise no one else will ever hear, but one that might last longer than anything said aloud. You glance down at your lap, maybe imagining cloth pooling there. And if you were living in a small medieval village somewhere tucked between smoke and sheep, the gift resting across your knees might not be a bouquet or a veil. It would be an apron, rough woven, homespun, and laced with intention. In many parts of medieval Europe, giving a woman an apron wasn't a household gesture, it was a rite of passage, a symbol of transition from girlhood to womanhood, from daughter to wife, from dependent to keeper of the hearth. When a man offered an apron to a woman, especially in farming communities stretching from the Scottish Highlands to the rural plains of Hungary, it meant one thing: I trust you with the heart of a home. Not the key, not the ring, the apron. To accept it was to accept responsibility not just for meals or mending, but for stability, survival, and lineage. It's easy to forget how central the apron once was. Today it conjures images of baking or kitsch, but back then, it was armor, it was ledger, it was altar. The fabric absorbed flour, milk, blood, and soot. It protected the belly and wiped the tears of children. It was the place where herbs were gathered, seeds stored, bread dough kneaded, and sometimes quietly, solemnly, it was where stillborn infants were wrapped and buried. So when a man gave a woman an apron, he wasn't flattering her. He was kneeling before a future he knew would be held together by her hands. In villages where looms and spindles hummed like background breath, the apron was usually woven by older women mothers, aunts, neighbors who'd endured famine and fire. They spun the threads tight, dyed them with what they had: onion skins for gold, nettles for green, bloodroot for a warm, rusted red. They stitched symbols into the seam stars, wheat stalks, sometimes just dots. These were quiet blessings, meant to keep illness away or ease childbirth, and the woman who received it didn't simply wear it. She stepped into a role, a vocation. One recorded account from rural Moravia tells of a girl who cried when given her marriage apron, not out of sorrow, but gravity. She said, "Now my name stays inside the house." She meant that she was no longer a daughter flitting through fields. She was a center now, a flame in one place. The apron often came before the ceremony. A suitor might visit the woman's home and offer it in a folded bundle. If she accepted, she would tie it on in front of her mother. If she refused, she'd place it back on the hearth without a word. No ring necessary, just cloth and silence. In parts of Germany and Austria, aprons had specific bands of embroidery known as Herzränder heart borders. These were stitched in bright thread across the lower hem. Some included initials of both the bride and groom. Others held secret codes 3 stitches up, 1 down, repeating in a rhythm that could only be read if you knew the key. One woman reportedly stitched the phrase, "He came in the rain," into the hem of her apron, and wore it under a thick overskirt every market day until the day he proposed. Historians still debate whether these aprons functioned as bridal markers, dowry symbols, or simple domestic gifts. But for the women who wore them, the answer was simpler: they were sacred. A ring could be admired. An apron had to be used. Some aprons were ceremonial, worn only during the first meal cooked as a wife. One Flemish bride baked bread while wearing her mother's apron over her gown, then folded it, blood and all, into her wedding chest. Her daughter later wore the same one, layered over new linen. That's how history lingered in flower dust and stitch lines. And don't let the softness of fabric fool you. Aprons were often built with strength in mind. Wide waistbands reinforced with extra weft, shoulder ties braided for durability, bottom corners weighted with stones or beans to keep the hem from flapping in wind. A woman wasn't just wearing a garment, she was anchoring herself to the day's demands. In Slavic lands, some aprons had hidden pouches sewn inside them not for coins, but for talismans, a dried cherry pit, a tiny carved hand, a pinch of salt. These were the same pouches where women kept tokens from their betrothed: an iron nail, a wooden bead, even a tooth from the man's hunting hound. Love wasn't always romantic. Sometimes it was practical. There's a particularly eerie tradition in the Carpathians where a bride would wear a red apron on the night before her wedding, then burn it in the hearth just before dawn. The ashes were swept into a jar and buried under the threshold of the home she'd enter with her husband. It was believed that the fire cleansed her name and that the ashes would anchor her into the new household. And yes, there were failures. Not all apron-gifted marriages held. One tale from a Scottish isle tells of a woman who sewed her apron closed after her husband left to sea and never returned. She hung it by the chimney, untouched, for the rest of her life. Visitors said it looked like a warning, but she insisted it was a lighthouse. In Iceland, some aprons were passed down so many generations that they no longer resembled clothing. They were fragments, patches, and linen ghosts. Yet still, when a girl came of age, a great aunt would pull the bundle from a chest and say, "This one held many." And the girl would take it not out of pressure, but reverence, to wear what others had survived in. Even the act of tying the apron had meaning. Some women tied it tightly, crossing the strings in front, a sign of control, strength. Others let the ties hang loose, as if saying, "This love is not bound, but chosen." A widow might knot the apron twice, a newlywed once. A woman hoping for a child, she'd tie it low and leave a sprig of rosemary tucked into the waistband. The church tolerated aprons in marriage rituals, seeing them as practical, even modest, but it never truly embraced their deeper meaning. They weren't sacred enough, not ornate, not Latin, and yet they endured, because they didn't need a priest. They needed only hands. So as you sit now, warm under your blanket, imagine accepting a folded apron. It smells faintly of smoke and thyme. The fabric is rough, but clean. The threads are uneven, but strong. You tie it around your waist, and in that moment, you are no longer just someone waiting. You are someone keeping, someone who holds the flame steady while the winds howl. No ring, no jewels, just cloth and the weight of 1,000 meals, births, tears, and quiet moments stitched into its seams. That was marriage. Once, not shown off, but lived in, not displayed, but worn. You rub your thumb against your palm, as if something should be there, something coarse, maybe, or ancient. And if you were a bride in certain corners of medieval Europe, what should be there isn't a gem or a smooth band of metal. It's a stone, not polished, not carved, just a stone rounded by a river current, or chipped from a mountainside and already warm from the hands that passed it to you. In folk traditions scattered from Brittany to the Balkans, the wart-stone and the blood drop weren't metaphors. They were tools, rites, binding rituals passed between lovers who had no use for gold. You wouldn't find them in cathedrals or marriage charters, but you'd find them in fields and kitchens and sacred hollows, where nature had more authority than the priest. Historians still argue whether these practices trace back to pre-Christian fertility rites or to monastic folklore. But what's certain is this: when a woman touched a stone and whispered a name while her blood mixed with wine, she was no longer unmarried. Wartstones weren't called that because they looked like warts, they were believed to heal them. Smooth, porous, strangely shaped stones passed down through households. But in courtship rituals, especially in the Scottish Highlands and Galician valleys, these stones were used to absorb a couple's uncertainty. A woman would press her palm to the stone, then the man would press his over hers. If they both felt heat and imagined warmth, yes, but real to them, it was considered a sign. Some even said the stone would quiver, though likely that was the tremble of nerves. Afterward, the stone was either kept in the home or buried near the threshold, never thrown away, never reused. It belonged to that promise. In one haunting account from a shepherding village in Asturias, a young woman cut her fingertip on a thorn and let a single drop of blood fall onto a stone her lover had given her. She pressed her hand to it, then handed it back. He carried it for years. When he died, it was found in a pouch around his neck. She never married. "My name lives in stone," she said, when asked why. The blood and wine ritual was rarer, whispered more than witnessed. In isolated communities, especially among Slavic peoples, a couple might each prick their fingers just a pinprick, enough to draw a bead of red, and let their blood mix into a shared cup of wine. They'd drink it, say nothing, and bury the cup beneath the hearth or near a tree. The wine wasn't for celebration, it was for sealing. One life poured into another, swallowed, hidden, planted. There was no applause, only silence, and the weight of what had just been done. It sounds dramatic, doesn't it? Even dangerous. But in a world where marriage wasn't about cake or invitations, it had to feel like something. These rituals weren't for show. They were for memory, for making sure your body remembered even when your mind did not. Some women used their own blood, discreetly, pressing it into thread and sewing a cross inside the sleeve of their husband's shirt. It wasn't witchcraft. It was intention. He might never see it, but she would. Every time she washed his clothes, every time she mended a seam, that small, dried mark would whisper, "You belong to someone." Warstones also found their way into childbirth. A woman who had vowed by stone would often place it beneath the bed during labor. If the birth went well, the stone was passed to her daughter. If it went poorly, the stone was buried. In some families, these stones were named Grey Sister, Watcher, Palm Eye. They were kept like relics, not because they had magic, but because they had memory. In Brittany, one recorded ritual involved placing the wart stone on the chest, between the breasts after the wedding night, then moving it to the hearth the next morning. The woman would not speak during this transition. It was said to draw the warmth of the union into the home. Symbolic, yes, but also deeply sensory. Marriage was not abstract. It was felt beneath the ribs, on the skin, in the taste of iron in your mouth, after a drop of blood mixed with wine. There's a chilling folktale from the Swiss Alps about a bride who used a wart stone from her grandmother's grave. She placed it under her pillow every night for a week before her wedding. On the seventh night, she dreamed of her grandmother weeping. She married anyway. Within a year, her husband left. The villagers blamed the stone. She buried it beside the same grave, poured wine on the soil, and never spoke of it again. The church, as you'd expect, tried to outlaw blood rituals entirely. They called it pagan, heretical. One bishop wrote, "No woman shall mix her flesh with the drink of man outside sacrament, lest she bind herself to shadow." But the rituals persisted, quietly, because for many women, a drop of blood was worth more than a ring. You couldn't melt it. You couldn't pawn it. It proved, and for couples without means, without permission, without time, these symbols worked because they were immediate. A stone cost nothing. A drop of blood took only a moment. But once done, it could not be undone. There were no annulments for the wine and blood vow, only weathering. Some stones were worn as pendants, strung on coarse cord and hidden beneath clothing, not for fashion, for continuity. One woman, recorded in a 14th century Austrian ledger, wore hers through 10 winters. When it finally cracked from frost, she claimed it meant her marriage was done. Her husband left 3 weeks later. Coincidence, perhaps. But who argues with a stone that split itself? Even names changed. In parts of Estonia, women who took blood vows stopped using their given name on feast days. They would instead go by the name of the place where they buried their cup or stone. Bride of the Birch Root, Wife of Cold Hollow, Lady of Winter Eye. These weren't fanciful titles. They were reminders of where the promise had taken root. It's easy to look back and scoff at all this. We have DNA tests now, prenups, paperwork, but paper tears, stones do not. And the body remembers what the mind wants to forget. That's why the prick of the needle, the sting of the thorn, The iron tang of blood in your mouth, those things lasted. They weren't symbolic. They were physical, intimate, unforgiving. And when you touch your own skin now, what do you feel? Pulse, warmth. That's all the women before you needed to say yes. They didn't wait for permission. They made promises with what they had: a cup, a stone, a drop, and once made, they held. So tonight, as you lie there, heartbeat steady, imagine pressing your hand to a cool stone in the dark. Imagine sharing a sip of wine turned faintly red. No crowd, no music, just silence, and a vow that lives in your body long after your words are gone. You think of fruit now, maybe without knowing why your mind drifting toward pomegranates, figs, little red apples that fit in the palm. And if you were a woman in a medieval village, standing at the edge of harvest season, such fruit could mean more than nourishment. It could mean marriage. In parts of the Mediterranean, across Sicily, southern Spain, and the Levantine coastline, and even scattered pockets of rural France, the giving of fruit, particularly ripe, seeded, or split fruit, was not simply a romantic gesture. It was a declaration, a pact, a proposal. And when a man handed a woman a pomegranate, or tucked an apple into her apron, or offered her a slice of honey-dripping fig in the shade of a tree, he was doing something older than vows. He was asking her to join his life, and if she accepted the fruit, bit into it without words, or broke it open in return, that union was acknowledged, not by law, not by priests, but by neighbors, by elders, and by the rhythm of the land itself. Historians still argue whether this fruit-giving was a remnant of pagan fertility rites or a clever domestic workaround for social hierarchies. But no matter the origin, it endured. Fruit was symbolic in every direction. A pomegranate, with its many seeds, stood for abundance and lineage. An apple, particularly a small vibrant red, homegrown apple, meant the giver was offering not only himself, but his future orchard, his labor, his shade. A fig was more intimate, often shared between two people already entwined in some way. If he gave her a fig and she didn't eat it immediately, it meant hesitation. If she bit into it slowly and handed him the other half, it meant trust. These gestures didn't come from fairy tales. They came from afternoons in dry fields, from stone houses where words were few but eyes said enough. In southern Italy, there was a tradition of giving a bride a baked fruit cake made of boiled down pears, plums, and honey on the morning of her wedding. But the custom ran deeper. The true vow happened weeks earlier, when the man had first offered her the raw ingredients: plums wrapped in linen, pears folded into parchment. If she accepted them, the wedding was assumed. If not, the fruit was returned with a sprig of basil, signaling refusal. One woman reportedly pressed her rejected apple so hard in her fist that her palm bled when asked about it later. She said only, "I wanted to bruise it before I let it go." Some fruit packs were seasonal. In autumn, the offering carried urgency. If a man handed over a last-of-season pomegranate, it was a way of saying, "I want to begin winter with you. I want the cold with you." In spring, a peach meant hope. In summer, a melon split and shared meant generosity. These meanings weren't written. They were whispered, passed down, and always known. In rural Spain, especially in the Aragonese hills, a man might carve his initials into an apple and leave it on the woman's doorstep before dawn. If she carved hers beside his and left it on her window ledge by midday, it meant yes. If the apple disappeared but was never mentioned, it meant no. And if the apple remained untouched, shriveling on the sill, it meant she was mourning someone past or possible. One such apple was reportedly kept for a year before being boiled into jam and served quietly to the man who had waited. They married with no fanfare, but everyone remembered the waiting fruit. Some communities used fruit in ritual exchange rather than private offering. In Georgian villages, there was the fruit bowl walk, where eligible men would walk through town carrying bowls of gathered fruit. Women could take a piece from any bowl, but only one. That choice marked the beginning of a courtship. One wrong piece, one glance misread, and the season could slip away unmarried. There was tension, joy, nerves, and a kind of honest hunger woven into every movement. A fringe tradition from Dalmatian Islands tells of fruit pacts made in secret between women and men from rival families. In these cases, the fruit acted not just as a promise, but as a weapon against arranged matches. A woman might accept an apricot from her chosen love and keep the pit hidden in her apron for days, waiting for the right moment to drop it into her family's stew pot. It was her silent rebellion. Bitterness in the food meant bitterness in the forced bond. One old woman, known in her village as Stone Pit, carried dozens of pits in a pouch tied to her waist. She said she never married, but she helped 20 others find their own way out. Even within marriage, fruit held meaning. Couples who had wed without formal ceremony sometimes renewed their bond by planting a fig tree together or harvesting their first peaches side by side. In such moments, no words were spoken. The fruit itself, its ripeness, its blemishes, its abundance or scarcity was the message. If the harvest was small but sweet, they smiled. If it was rotten or dry, they worked harder. No blame, just recognition. One particularly beautiful story comes from a Turkish village where a man gave his bride a basket of dates with a single rose hidden among them. She took the rose out and placed it behind her ear, then handed him back one date still unripe. Hard, she said, not sweet yet. Wait with me. He did. 3 months later, they tried again. This time, the date was soft. She ate it. They were married by moonlight, not because the fruit had changed, but because they had. The church, predictably, mistrusted these rituals. Fruit was too sensual, too linked to the body, too much like Eve. Several bishops condemned the practice of seduction by apple as dangerous and irreverent. But try telling that to a girl with calloused fingers and no dowry, who'd just been handed the season's first peach by the boy who helped her carry water. That peach meant more than any sermon. And for those who couldn't read or write, fruit became letter and ledger. A dried fig, wrapped in a kerchief and tucked into a trunk, might stay there for years, its sweetness long gone, but its meaning intact. Some women were buried with such fruit tokens: a shriveled pear, a pomegranate seed pouch, a slice of candied quince, still wrapped. The love outlasted the sugar. There's something timeless about it. You don't need to understand language to understand an offering. You don't need to explain yourself when you hand someone a ripe fig and look them in the eyes. That act says, I've waited. I've chosen. I offer you what nourishes me. I offer you what spoils, unless it is shared. So tonight, as the air settles around you and your thoughts wander, imagine holding a small apple in your hand. It's warm from the sun, not perfect, slightly bruised, but real. You extend it, and someone reaches back, not for your hand, but for the fruit. You don't speak. You don't need to. What's been given has already taken root, and the sweetness that follows, that's the beginning of something old. You run your hand down the seam of your shirt, feeling the stitch lines, the tiny imperfections, and if you lived centuries ago, you might be searching not for flaws, but for secrets. Because in many corners of medieval Europe, the truest symbols of marriage weren't worn on the hand, weren't shown at all, but were hidden in the hems, in the quiet folds of linen, in the unseen linings of gowns and tunics. Women stitched vows into fabric names, initials, dates, prayers, even symbols only they understood. These were private signatures, woven not for beauty, but for memory. While the world demanded that marriage be seen, these women ensured it was felt. Historians still argue whether these stitched tokens were remnants of older ritual spells, or simply the heart's instinct to make love tangible. But the pattern is clear: when the ring was too expensive, when the priest was too far, when the world was too loud, a hem was a sanctuary. These weren't grand garments. Often, they were everyday clothes, a smock worn under a gown, a nightdress, an apron. The stitching was done alone, usually by candlelight, often in silence. A single thread of red for love, black for mourning, blue for hope. Some women stitched their partner's name into the side seam, where the fabric folded near the ribs. Others used symbols: a star, a knot, a tiny woven eye. You wouldn't notice them unless you turned the garment inside out and held it up to the light, which, of course, was the point. These vows weren't made for witnesses. They were made for survival. In northern France, especially among weavers' families. There was a custom of the hidden thread. A bride-to-be would embroider a single phrase into the lining of her wedding shift, something her mother or grandmother had taught her. Not scripture, but wisdom. One phrase, passed down through 3 generations. Read, "If he forgets, you still remember." The needle moved slowly, deliberately, each stitch a breath. A woman in Bohemia reportedly stitched her entire wedding date, day, month, year, into the collar seam of her only gown. The thread was so fine it took a magnifying glass centuries later to uncover it. She wore that gown for feasts, funerals, childbirth. No one ever saw the date, but she knew it was there, brushing the back of her neck like a silent guardian. And it wasn't just brides. Widows sometimes stitched the name of their lost husbands into the cuffs of their mourning dresses, not to display grief, but to contain it, to wear it where it would rub gently against the wrist, where tears might fall naturally. It wasn't performance, it was ritual. Some women stitched the first letter of their husband's name into the hem of every new garment they made after marriage. It was a way of saying, this life is shared. One seamstress in Bruges made a full alphabet in hidden threads her initials, his, and those of their 7 children. She called it her thread book. When her gown was finally passed down, it was unpicked, read like a story, and then resewn by her granddaughter. No other record of their family remains, just that cloth. And then there were the secret marks, tiny X's, arrows, circles. A woman in Estonia stitched a pair of interlocking spirals into her underskirt, one for her, one for him. She told no one. When she was buried, the garment was folded into her chest, and no one disturbed it. Spirals to spirals, thread to thread. There's even record of women stitching prayers not to God, but to the earth, to their own bodies, to the walls of the house they were entering. One common phrase in rural Ireland was, "Let my name stay here when I go." It was sewn into sleeves, especially if the woman was leaving her family to move far away. You might wear that sleeve until the fabric thinned to nothing, but the prayer would remain. A fringe tradition in Lombardy involved bridal garters woven with initials stitched in with hair, not visible from a distance, not even always distinguishable by touch, but present, held between fabric and flesh. You might forget what you whispered on your wedding night, but your stitches would remember. Not all stitches were solemn. Some were playful. In the Basque countryside, it was said that if a bride stitched a small animal, usually a rabbit or a cat, into her hem, it would guarantee a spirited household. These were stitched upside down, so they stood only when she sat. Children would try to catch glimpses of them during festivals, giggling if they saw Mama's secret cat, and some were defiant. One woman from a German village stitched the phrase, "still mine," into the cuff of her husband's shirt after he threatened to leave her. He never did. Was it the stitching? Was it the fear? Was it just the weight of those 2 words, pressing against his wrist day after day? Historians don't speculate, but the shirt survives. Stitches weren't always inside garments. Some were sewn into blankets, pillowcases, the edges of tablecloths used during the first shared meal. One woman in Galicia embroidered the phrase, "bitter or sweet," still yours, along the hem of her table runner. Her husband reportedly never noticed. She said that made it stronger. There's something deeply human about stitching memory into fabric. It's quiet, private. It requires no applause, no witness, no permission. You don't need a ring to carry a promise. You need a needle, a thread, and time. And when the cloth wears down, when the color fades, the stitch remains. Thinner, yes, but still there. The church rarely commented on these practices. They were too domestic, too small, not scandalous enough. But in their silence, women found freedom. No priest needed to sanction the thread. No man needed to see it. The power was in the secrecy, the sacred made soft. So tonight, feel your own clothes. Trace a seam. Imagine if someone had stitched your name into the hem, not for you to see, but for you to feel, not as decoration, but as memory, as vow. Because once, marriage wasn't performed. It was worn, lived in, sewn thread by thread into the ordinary fabrics of life. And somewhere, beneath centuries of silk and satin and lace. Those invisible stitches are still holding. You lie still now, perhaps starting to feel the strange hush of all these gestures, all these buried customs accumulating like threads in the dark, but you haven't heard the quietest one yet, because not every medieval marriage came with a token, not every vow had a witness, and not every promise was sealed with blood or bread. Sometimes, a marriage was simply two people, alone, without permission, without approval, just together, in a bed, in a clearing, in a rented room above a tavern. And the most surprising thing, it counted. In many regions and time periods across medieval Europe, a marriage didn't require a ring or even a church. It required mutual consent spoken clearly, once, in the presence of each other. That's all. Historians still argue over how valid these unions were, legally or religiously, but in practice they were binding. So long as you believed yourselves married and lived as such, then you were. No witnesses, no documents, just belief. That was enough, and it terrified the institutions that depended on being asked first. This kind of union had names: clandestine marriage, hand fasting, common law spouse, but to the people who lived them, there was no label. It was just waking up beside someone again, and again, and again, and not leaving in England, especially before the Council of Trent formalized sacramental requirements in Catholic countries. It was common for couples to wed by words of present consent. If you said, "I take you as mine, from this day forward," and they said the same, that was it. You were married. If you slept together afterwards, even more so. If you moved in together, shared a hearth, supported each other, then no priest or noble or uncle with a quill could deny you were joined. There's a record from 14th century York of a weaver and a butcher's daughter who married this way alone, in a field, with only a cow for company. When asked by the parish later if they were husband and wife, the woman replied, "He gave me no ring, but I've warmed his feet for 4 winters." That was the marriage. No license, no parade, just 4 winters of shared wool and aches and trust. In Scotland and the borderlands, hand-fasting ceremonies often served this role. Though often formalized with community participation, there were cases where 2 people simply clasped hands, declared themselves wed, and began life together. The knots, the cords, the candles, those came later, if at all. What mattered most was presence. 2 people, facing each other, agreeing, and if it fell apart, that too was handled quietly. No annulments, no scandal, just one person leaving, one person staying. In some cases, a woman who had been left would keep the shared hearth, keep the bed, and in doing so, keep the marriage in name even if not in presence. One Welsh tale tells of a woman who waited by the same stream every market day, just in case he came back. She didn't speak of him, but she never took another. She said once, "My vow was to a name, not a man." In Bohemia, some couples eloped not out of rebellion, but because they believed a public ceremony diluted the truth. A wedding with too many eyes, they said, became theater. But a wedding whispered in the dark, that was real. One pair of lovers reportedly married under a full moon beside the foundation of a ruined chapel. No priest, no fire, just a broken stone and shared breath. When asked how long they'd been together, the woman said, "Since the owl sang." That was her calendar. Of course, these quiet unions often ran into trouble. The church insisted on bans read aloud. Communities demanded dowries, contracts, witnesses, but people still chose one another in silence, because sometimes love came too quickly, too quietly, or too desperately for paperwork. One man in southern France gave his betrothed a broken comb and said, "We share this. Let us share the rest." And they did. For 33 years. A fringe practice found in the Alpine villages involved night pledges. A man and woman would meet under agreed terms, lie down together, and if in the morning neither left the bed before the other awoke, the vow was considered sealed. It was called the sleeping covenant. There was no need to speak. The act of remaining was enough. Even in aristocratic circles, this occurred. Bastards and second sons often wed unofficially, taking women of lower rank into their households and naming them wife. Despite the lack of legal ceremony, the woman might not be received at court, but she was received at the hearth, and when children came, they were baptized without question. The marriage was never announced, but everyone knew. In church records, these unions show up as problems, scandals, lines crossed out, cases dismissed or disputed, but behind those ink blots lived real families, real households where a man left his boots at the door and a woman hung her apron by the hearth. They had no rings, but they had memory. One of the most haunting aspects of these unrecorded unions is how easily they disappear. No legal trail, no portrait, no heirloom. Just oral stories passed down until no one remembers who the original couple even was. A woman in Tyrol once told her granddaughter that her grandmother had married under a tree with no fruit. When asked what that meant, the girl said, "It means they promised without witnesses and without expectations." Sometimes, the only proof was language. A woman calling the man my one, a man referring to the home as ours. No last names changed, but bread was shared, illnesses tended, lives built from touch and time. And it wasn't always romantic. Some unions began because of hunger, because of pregnancy, because two people had no one else. But they held, because holding was all they had. And that kind of vow, stitched through necessity, often proved stronger than gold. There's a story from a French village where an aging couple was asked when they'd married. The man replied, "After the fire." The woman nodded. "We lost everything, so we stayed. No papers, no altar, just a disaster, and a decision. So tonight, in the quiet of your own room, think of those who married without the world's permission, who didn't stand in front of an altar, but sat across from each other at a table, tired, and still chose to stay. No rings, no lace, no applause, just two people and the courage to name something together. That, too, was marriage." You press your fingers together now, perhaps absent-mindedly, perhaps not, because some part of you senses the weight of everything that came before this moment. The braids, the stones, the gloves, the bread, the belts, the salt, the threads hidden in seams, they've all lingered, even if you never saw them. And here's the quiet truth they never really left. Modern life may have replaced the bone rings and pomegranate seeds with diamonds and Pinterest boards, but the shape of the gesture, the heart of the offering still lives in your body. The way you tie your shoelace for someone else without being asked, the way your hand hovers when they're upset, unsure whether to reach, the way you fold their shirt when they're gone, even though no one told you to. Historians still argue how many of these medieval tokens directly evolved into our modern rituals. Did handfasting become engagement? Did the apron become the veil? Did the fruit offering turn into cake cutting? The academic threads twist and fray? Impossible to follow perfectly. But beneath all of that ambiguity, something remains stubborn and beautiful. The human instinct to mark love not with spectacle, but with the ordinary. It happens every time someone places a worn sweatshirt over a partner's shoulders, just because they looked cold. It happens in the text message that says home without punctuation, and the reply is almost, "These are echoes. Faint, yes, but real." Not everything was replaced. Some things just changed costume. The ring, for example. It did win. Eventually, gold outlasted wool. Diamonds outshone cherry wood, but that doesn't mean the others lost. Because for every engagement ring posted online, there's still someone keeping an old ticket stub in a wallet, or a broken button from a shirt that no longer fits, or a dried flower that once meant yes. Even today, there are women who stitch the wedding date into the inside hem of their dress, not because anyone will see it, but because they will feel it brush their thigh when they walk. Some men still carry a coin in their pocket from the night they proposed. Some couples keep a candle stub from the first dinner they shared after moving in together. These are not medieval, and yet they are. These are your wart stones, your sleeve tokens, your secret cords knotted to bedposts. The vocabulary has shifted, but the language hasn't. In fact, some of these customs have resurfaced quietly, wrapped in new meaning. The popularity of handfasting in neo-pagan and secular weddings is more than aesthetic. It's a return, a recognition that not everyone wants to say forever, in a ballroom filled with rented centerpieces. Some people still want to stand in the woods, or at the edge of a field, or beside a body of water that doesn't speak unless spoken to. They want to say, "I promise," and tie it with fabric. Even the trend of planting trees at weddings, a sapling for a new life, traces back to those fruit tree vows. Those fig pit promises buried in soft soil. One couple plants an olive tree, another carves initials into a birch. Neither thinks of it as medieval, but it is. The pomegranate split in half. The apple left on the windowsill, those stories live there. In every green shoot meant to survive the winter. And think of the hands. We shake them. We hold them. We touch wrists when we speak. These small gestures might seem modern, but your ancestors touched hands too, when they pressed palms together over a shared stone, or tied cloth around each other's wrists. The motion is the same. The meaning hasn't dulled. Sometimes, the most invisible traditions are the ones we live inside without realizing. The bed, for instance. You may not tie a cord to your bedpost anymore, but how many couples remember the first night they shared a mattress? How many remember the first time they rearranged their breathing to fit the same rhythm? That memory becomes its own cord, woven not from wool, but from sleeplessness and breath and the familiar weight of someone turning over in the dark. The modern home, too, echoes the old rites. The first shared grocery list, the mug someone always uses, the drawer full of takeout menus from a past apartment. These are the belts of faithfulness, the aprons of responsibility, disguised as clutter. You think you're just cohabiting, but somewhere in the back of a drawer is a receipt from the night you stopped being separate. You didn't frame it. You didn't mean to keep it, but you did. And the fruit, it's still there. A peach brought home because you like the fuzzy kind. A bowl of grapes left out, even though they were expensive, because they were your favorite. It's not a proposal anymore, but it is love. Not loud, not ornate, just ripened and offered. Even refusal has its place. The glove unreturned, the stone thrown into the sea, the apron never tied. These moments sting in memory, but they shape the landscape of love just as powerfully. For every union that lasted, there were 3 that whispered no. And even that quiet, painful, dignified was a vow of its own, a refusal to lie. There's also the unspoken vow of watching someone age beside you. No ceremony covers that, but you carry it. The way they reach for the railing, the way they fold socks slower. You don't need a new ring for that. You just need to stay. So many of the medieval women we've remembered tonight had no proof of their marriages but what they carried. A bit of cloth, a stitch, a stone, and now you carry things too. Not medieval, but not far off. The playlist you made, the photo you didn't delete, the coat that still smells like someone else. These aren't relics. They're living. They're the invisible weight of love as it moves through time, through generations who didn't need permission, just presence. And you, lying there now, are part of that lineage. You may not press your palm to a wardstone or drink wine mixed with blood, but when you say stay, or when you keep a secret that was never meant to be told, or when you fold a shirt that isn't yours, you're doing what they did. You're marrying someone again and again without saying the word. So when people ask what medieval women used instead of wedding rings, you can say everything and nothing: bread, cord, apron, glove, a peach, a stone, a name whispered by a well, and sometimes just a silence shared between 2 people who knew what they meant. And maybe, in your own way, you've done the same. So now, as the night deepens and the rhythm of your breath begins to slow, let the story soften around you like old linen. Let the stitches fade from view, the fruit grow still on the branch, the gloves untie themselves and fall quietly to the ground. You've walked through a world where rings weren't needed because meaning lived in the margins, in threads you couldn't see, in gestures that didn't need to be explained, in rituals that asked for presence more than perfection. And perhaps, as you lie there now, you begin to feel how close it all still is, how the ancient and the ordinary live side by side, how your own memories echo with the same quiet vows once whispered beneath braided hair or stitched into hidden hems. Not everything sacred comes with ceremony. Sometimes it just arrives in the shape of someone waiting at the door with your favorite mug, or brushing lint from your shoulder without saying a word, or sitting beside you in silence until you're ready to speak. Let all those medieval threads tuck themselves gently into your dreams tonight. Let them curl beneath your pillow, rest against your ribs, hold your name without needing to say it aloud. You don't need a ring to be remembered. You don't need witnesses to be known. You just need to feel it, the weight of love carried quietly, honestly, and without applause. So breathe in now. Let it be slow. The story is folded, the fire has burned low, and everything that needed to be said has already been sown.